Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Opponents of a no-deal Brexit say they'll present a bill in Parliament this week aimed at preventing the UK leaving the EU without a withdrawal agreement in place. Labour's Sir Keir Starmer told the BBC that if the legislation is passed, it's likely to mean a delay to the current departure date, the 31st of October. Cabinet Minister Michael Gove refused to commit the government to implementing such a law, saying it would wait to see what happens in Westminster this week. Here's our political correspondent, Ian Watson.
A weekend of protest on the streets. A week of rebellion at Westminster lies ahead.
Save our democracy!
These demonstrators want the suspension of Parliament later this month lifted. But the politicians will still meet this week. Opposition MPs and some Conservative rebels will attempt to stop Boris Johnson taking the UK out of the EU without a deal. But how?
Very simple. The route will be by legislation, because I believe there has got to be legislation in place to lock this and make it unlawful for him to take us out without a deal.
But this could lead to a further delay to Brexit.
Obviously, if we're at the 31st of October, that will require an extension. But I think this should be a very short, simple exercise.
So, if the opposition parties pass a law to stop no deal, will the government respect it? This Cabinet Minister refused repeated invitations to say that the government would abide by the will of Parliament.
We will see what the legislation says when it is put forward. Let's see what the legislation says. You're asking me about a pig in a poke. Let's see what the legislation is that he puts forward.
So what could happen if Boris Johnson's defeated? The Prime Minister has argued that if MPs rule out no deal, they'll weaken his hand in negotiations with Brussels. So rather than accept MPs' instructions to delay Brexit, he may well try to call an early general election instead. But that would need the agreement of 2/3 of MPs at Westminster. And the Liberal Democrats have said explicitly, and Labour have hinted strongly today, that they would only allow this to happen if polling day comes before and not after we leave the European Union. Of course, all this could be avoided if Boris Johnson gets a deal. But Michel Barnier, the EU's chief negotiator, said Brussels won't be poring over new plans unless they're very similar to the ones he previously agreed.
Importing goods from the EU.
And this week, the government will step up its campaign to get people ready for Brexit. But how ready really are we for no deal? For example, will food supplies be unaffected?
Everyone will have the food they need. Some prices may go up. Other prices will come down.
You know it's going to be a big week in Parliament when the world's media sets up camp on its doorstep. The next few days could determine how, when and indeed if we leave the European Union.
And Ian Watson's live for us in Westminster now. How much pressure does all of this place on the Prime Minister and his Brexit strategy, Ian?
It places huge pressure on the Prime Minister, Michelle, because he's staring defeat in the face when MPs come back here on September the 3rd, on Tuesday. Now, interestingly though, there's also going to be huge pressure placed on Conservative MPs who are planning to rebel against the Prime Minister and vote with the opposition to try to prevent no deal. So, for example, pulled away in the Prime Minister's country estate at Chequers today, we had Boris Johnson meeting the government whips, those in charge of government discipline, and they were cooking up plans to turn the screw on Conservative MPs who might vote with the opposition.
Ian Watson, thank you very much. Apologies for the slightly distorted sound on that.
A new Brexit controversy has blown up tonight over how the government might respond to any legislation aimed at blocking no deal. Michael Gove, one of the most senior figures in Boris Johnson's cabinet, refused to say whether the government would abide by any such law passed by MPs. Labour called this breathtaking and said no government is above the law. More from our political correspondent, Daniel Hewitt.
The mother of all parliaments will this week host the mother of all battles between a government promising Brexit at any cost and an opposition determined to stop them. MPs will try to pass a law blocking Boris Johnson leaving the EU without a deal, a law the government today suggested it may simply ignore.
Let's see what the legislation says. You're asking me about a pig in a poke, and I will wait to see what legislation the opposition may try to bring forward, but we know what their intention is.
We're in new constitutional times, but for a government to say we won't abide by legislation is impossible, surely.
We will see what the legislation says when it is put forward.
That has been met with outrage by Labour and some Conservative MPs, including this one Tory backbencher. They are suggesting that even if Parliament passed a law requiring the government to avoid no deal, he said, they may simply ignore it. Our very democracy is now under threat from Boris Johnson and his government. Others urge them to rethink.
If governments feel able to differentiate between bits of legislation that come forward as to whether or not they might accept it, I think that would be very worrying. And I hope it would understand that if Parliament passes legislation, the government has an obligation. But of course, there are consequences in that whole situation.
But the Prime Minister is pressing ahead, today meeting with government whips at his country retreat Chequers to decide what to do about Tory MPs planning to rebel, with talk of threats to kick them out of the party. A tad hypocritical, say those facing such threats.
If it is the position now that defying a whip on a European vote is a matter that you lose the whip for the Conservative Party, then I think there's quite a lot of Conservative MPs who, over the recent months, would have lost the whip. But sometimes there is a point where you have to judge between your own personal interests and the national interest, and the national interest has to come first.
This week, the nation will see the first signs of the government's billboard campaign to push you to get ready for a no-deal Brexit, as Parliament gets ready to stop that happening altogether.
And Daniel has joined me. So, Dan, are we building up to a massive showdown between the government and MPs this coming week?
Yeah, it's set to be an extraordinary week in Westminster in every sense of the word. Tomorrow, Boris Johnson will meet with David Gauke, who you saw in my report there, and other Tory rebels to try and persuade them not to join opposition MPs in legislating against a no-deal Brexit. Then on Tuesday, opposition MPs will attempt to wrestle hold of the House of Commons order paper, effectively take control of Parliament, to try and pass a law compelling Boris Johnson to go to Brussels and seek a Brexit delay. Now, they have probably until Monday week to do that. The timing's pretty tight, but it is definitely doable with the help of the Speaker, John Bercow. Now, despite today's comments by Michael Gove, I've been speaking tonight to one senior Number 10 source who was trying to play down this idea the government would seriously consider breaking the law, ignoring Parliament. That said, it's impossible to see Boris Johnson abiding by that law, going to Brussels and saying, yep, OK, let's delay Brexit, when he has categorically, time and time again, said we are leaving on October the 31st, which means we're in this stalemate. And one way out of that stalemate, maybe the only way, would be a general election. One Jeremy Corbyn's been asking for, one Boris Johnson's been preparing for. The question is, would it come either before October the 31st or after October the 31st?
OK, Daniel, thank you very much.
Well, as MPs opposed to a no-deal Brexit prepare to try and thwart it in Parliament, the government has launched a £100 million advertising campaign, urging people to get ready for Brexit. But with just 60 days until the October 31st deadline, the minister in charge of no-deal planning today said that some food prices could rise after we leave the EU. Victoria McDonald has this report.
£2 per pound on the strawberries.
Ahead of what is likely to be one of the most difficult weeks in recent parliamentary history, celery is on the menu, and cauliflower, tomatoes, onions and potatoes, all imported from the EU. But we were told today a no deal does not mean shortages.
No, there will be no shortages of fresh food.
Will food prices go up, as you used to say was inevitable?
Well, I think that there are a number of economic factors in play. Some prices may go up. Other prices will come down.
The British Food Consortium said it was categorically untrue that fresh food supplies would be unaffected. However, this is the week in which there will be concerted attempts to prevent a no deal. On Tuesday, MPs return to Parliament. Attempts will then be made by those opposed to a no-deal Brexit to take control of the parliamentary timetable. If they are successful, they will introduce primary legislation forcing a delay to Brexit beyond October the 31st.
Every vote is going to count. But what Boris Johnson has done in shutting down Parliament is actually to bolster those that are against no deal, because everybody knows the window is very, very narrow now. And this is the time, I think, for everybody to ask themselves, which side am I on in this whole no-deal Brexit discussion?
Yet even if the legislation is passed, Mr Gove this morning refused to confirm that the government would abide by it.
We see a deal coming down the line, and just as we see the light at the end of the tunnel, Keir is saying, let's have more tunnel. I do not believe that the British people want more delay, more prevarication, more denial of their original democratic verdict.
It's also reported that the Prime Minister wouldn't rule out measures to force through a no deal, including asking the Queen to refuse to give a bill royal assent.
What nobody knows is if the numbers are there to get through any of this legislation. Certainly there are some high-profile Tory rebels, including the former Chancellor Philip Hammond and the former Justice Secretary David Gauke. The question is, if push comes to shove, will they vote against their government? Tomorrow, they will be meeting with the Prime Minister Boris Johnson to hear what his plans are to avoid a no deal.
When are we putting forward proposals to deal with this backstop issue, which is the one issue he has identified as the problem within the withdrawal agreement? I want to hear how he's going to address that, and I want to hear how he plans to deliver the legislation, if we get a deal, by the 31st of October.
The Prime Minister has talked of signs of progress in the Brexit discussions, but today the EU's chief negotiator, Michel Barnier, once again insisted the critical Irish backstop aimed at preventing a hard border across Ireland cannot be renegotiated. So, in the meantime, preparing for October the 31st, the Cabinet Office launched this today, linking through to warnings of delays at the borders and encouraging people to renew their passports.
Victoria MacDonald reporting there. Well, one former Conservative minister opposed to leaving the EU without a deal is Alistair Burt. I spoke to him a little earlier and I began by asking him how far he would go to stop a no-deal Brexit.
I had been hoping before Parliament, before the government announced its plans on prorogation, that we would have a good bit of time between now and the European Council to debate these matters. I was certainly prepared to vote this week to reduce the conference recess in order to give us more time to do so, and I'm disappointed at the plans for prorogation that they are so long. So I would vote to try and reduce the recess time if that's at all possible, and in the meantime, if there is an opportunity to vote to allow Parliament to have the chance to consider whether or not it wants to support no deal or wants to continue to urge the government to seek a deal, I will vote for that.
You are now considered a rebel who has apparently been threatened with deselection. I wonder what you feel about that.
Well, I find it a bit hard, really. I was someone who voted to remain in the EU, then I accepted the result of the referendum as a good Democrat. I voted consistently for the withdrawal agreement of the Prime Minister, and I noticed some current members of the Cabinet did not vote for that withdrawal agreement, and I think we're partly in the position we are in because those members of the Cabinet did not do so. And I find it a little bit hard after 32 years as a Member of Parliament, serving in every administration in some capacity or other, but this to be labelled a rebel, to be quite honest.
We've heard a senior minister this morning suggesting that the government could potentially ignore legislation passed by Parliament. What do you think about that?
Obviously troubled. I don't think government should be in that position. Government needs to accept legislation. If part of our decision to leave the EU is about Parliament taking back control, then it means what it says. And if governments get into the habit of ignoring or trying to avoid parliamentary scrutiny, well, I must say what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. And it won't be just a Conservative government that will have hit upon this as an idea. We're at a very delicate stage, and I know people's feelings run very high. So we have to be careful about our language and careful about how we use parliamentary institutions because, as I say, precedents matter.
Given how uncomfortable you seem to sound over the current situation, would you be willing to bring this government down if that's what it took?
I want to support a Conservative government. I have compromised in relation to my view on the European Union to the extent of wanting to see a Conservative government succeed outside the European Union with a deal and an arrangement that is good for both of us. I want that to be the case, and I want to support a Conservative government that will do that, and I don't really want to entertain thoughts of bringing down a Conservative government.
Do you think that you can persuade the Prime Minister at all tomorrow? Because your side of the argument is essentially lost. We've got people like Dominic Cummings in charge.
well, don't goad me. I thought we had been dealing with the issue of unelected bureaucrats in a different way. My sense is that the Prime Minister is obviously very strong-minded, but he understands both Parliament and he understands the difficulty of the negotiations he's got. I do hope he does listen. I think genuinely he wants to see a deal. I think he's got to look at the reality of whether the position he's taken or the position he is being persuaded to take is likely to get a deal or not. And even if he brings a deal back based on changes to the backstop, but with the withdrawal agreement largely in place, he needs to look at those who undermined Theresa May's government and ultimately brought it down by Conservative members who did not vote for the withdrawal agreement. There's still many of them, more than people like me, and if they're determined not to vote for the withdrawal agreement when he brings it back, then what price getting a deal at all? And I think some pressure should be put on them. They appear to be taking a position that even if the backstop is changed, they won't change their view. Why aren't they being put under some degree of pressure in order to change their position? Because that would affect things markedly.
OK, Alistair Burt, thanks very much for joining us. Alistair Burt MP speaking to me a little earlier, and within the last few minutes, Number 10 has told us it has withdrawn its offer of a meeting between the Prime Minister and a group of so-called rebel Tory MPs. Instead, the Prime Minister has offered Philip Hammond a one-to-one meeting. Number 10 cited diary pressures for the change. And to discuss the potentially turbulent week ahead, I'm joined from Kent by the broadcaster Ian Dale, who also writes for the Conservative Home website, and here in the studio, the Guardian columnist Zoe Williams. Welcome to you both, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Zoe Williams, you've been involved with these Stop the Coup protests.
Yeah.
I mean, that sort of language, there's no military tanks on the streets or a general on the TV screens. It's not a coup, is it?
I mean, actually, the main problem with the word coup was how easy it is to misspell. That was really that was the kind of main focus of the discussions. Look, you know, a lot of Conservative commentators are talking about prorogation in terms of Parliament has been prorogued before. This is a perfectly ordinary phase of process. You know, you proles don't really understand what it means anyway. There's a kind of lot riding on that. But the truth of it is, it's not about proroguing Parliament. It's about the executive moving explicitly against Parliament in order to pass legislation which Parliament doesn't want to pass, right? So we're not really talking about the technicalities of prorogue. We're talking about an executive against Parliament.
And you're happy to call that a coup?
Well, it's absolutely extraordinary. I cannot think. People keep saying it may be slightly similar to 1931, slightly similar to 1945, but I actually can't think constitutionally of a time when the executive has been ranged against Parliament similarly since 1642, when we had a civil war.
Well, let's just put that to Ian Dale, because Ian Dale, you think we all need to just calm down a bit?
I think we do. Talks of a coup, talks of Boris Johnson being a dictator are just risible. And I think anybody outside the political geek world that Zoe and I inhabit will just see that for what it is. Yes, it is Boris Johnson getting down and dirty, using parliamentary tactics, just as the Remainers have done for the last 18 months. He signalled that he intends to leave the European Union, come what may, on October the 31st. He has got a sense of direction which Theresa May's government didn't have. Now, you can disagree with it by all means, but when you look at the parliamentary shenanigans that the Remainers have indulged in over the last 18 months, and the Speaker ignoring all precedents as well, it's, as Zoe said, what's good for the goose is good for the gander.
OK, well, I mean, you heard their parliamentary shenanigans. There are a lot of people who voted to leave who will see this as more of the same, won't they?
I mean, that's such a giant question which doesn't actually address any of its individual bits. Sorry, no offence to the question. It's
you
just,
answer it.
The point is that whether or not people voted and knowing that there would be a no deal, which is incredibly contestable, you know, all the major figures in government now, principally Johnson and Gove, explicitly said there was no chance of no deal during the campaign, explicitly said a deal would be very easily come by. And so the idea that you can just say, well, the will of the people is that we leave with no deal, based on an election in which no deal was never mentioned, is just silly. It's preposterous. It doesn't even make sense within its own scheme. Furthermore, the idea that parliamentarians have been engaging in shenanigans or, you know, in technical fixes is simply untrue. What has happened in Parliament is people have discussed what's on the table and said, I don't like the look of it. And that's what Parliament is there for. You know, so you can say nobody deserves any scrutiny. We just need one strong leader to do everything, in which case you're actually not talking about a democracy, you're talking about a completely different sort of government. Or you say, how does Parliament scrutinise?
Okay.
That's what Parliament's been doing.
Well, let me bring Ian Dale back in. Look, Ian, this is about parliamentary scrutiny. We heard earlier today a government minister saying potentially the government could ignore a law passed by Parliament. Do you think we should calm down about that too?
Well, just before I answer that, Zoe seems to forget that in March 2017, MPs voted by 4-1 to trigger Article 50. And they knew then that if we didn't get a deal at the end of the 2-year period, we would be leaving with no deal. So no deal is no surprise, or ought not to be, to MPs who voted for it. Now, on the Michael Gove thing, I noticed that you didn't actually play any clip where Michael Gove said anything like that. I've just finished watching the Michael Gove interview, and I think you've interpreted that in a, well, shall we say, a very elastic way. I think it would be wholly unthinkable for a government to ignore a law that Parliament has passed. However, what you do then, if you can't get your own legislation through Parliament, or if Parliament has taken control and put its own law through Parliament, then you call a general election. That is the constitutional way out of this. And some people actually suspect that that is what Boris Johnson wants to do all along.
So this is all game playing, is it?
Well, you can call it game playing all you like, but in the end, he will do whatever he thinks is right to get us out of the European Union on the 31st of October. We talk a lot about, Zoe talked about the executive against Parliament. What she didn't say was Parliament against the people, because Parliament has, over the last 3.5 years, gone out of its way to frustrate any movement out of the EU, and it will continue to do so. All of these people who talk about scrutiny, what they actually mean is thwarting Brexit. They want to actually stop Brexit. Zoe will be honest about that because that's what she wants to do, but most of the MPs, they don't actually say that.
OK, thanks. Zoe, do you think we're heading for a constitutional crisis?
That's really silly. Can I just answer that first?
Well, can you answer my question? Do you think we're heading for a constitutional crisis?
So, in terms of a constitutional crisis, I think you're right. I think it is a bit of gameplay. I don't think they want a constitutional crisis. I don't think they do want to ignore the law. I think what they're trying to do is get a general election, but get the Labour Party to force it, because Boris Johnson clearly, having said there would be no general election, doesn't want to be the person to call one. So I think there is, you know, in a sense, Ian's right. We shouldn't take it too seriously because it is just, you know, kind of quite typical, quite dishonest political gameplay. But on the other hand, I think there will be residual constitutional problems raised by the behaviour so far.
Right, we're going to have to stop this behaviour for now. Zoe Williams, Ian Dale, thanks very much for joining us.